Hey there, and welcome. In this series, I'm going to be teaching you how to improve your mixes, and I'm going to be doing this in less of a tutorial way and more just explaining these general concepts. Because, in my opinion, when I've been looking through YouTube and trying to find information myself when I was starting out, I found that most of it was follow these steps or copy me exactly or whatever. And I want to go through and just talk about the general idea of things so that way you can do this stuff yourself and take it to your own creative level. So this is going to be just the introduction and talking about why mixing is important. So first thing is why is mixing important? Really, it helps not to really boost your creativity, but to help give you a creative outlet. In a sense, even if your track is really good quality creatively and is a good idea on a musical level, that doesn't matter if nobody can hear it. If it doesn't sound good, even if you like the idea, then it's just not going to get the attention that it deserves, and it's just not going to be as enjoyable to listen to, which I'm sure we all want our tracks to be enjoyable to listen to. Um, so I'm going to just go ahead and get started. I'm going to play you something that I have here, just a little demo, just 8 little tracks, just a short mix that I'm working on. So here we go. Okay, so you get the idea. Pretty simple stuff. I'm not going to play the whole thing because it's just a loop after that point, just for demo purposes. So I'm going to go through and explain the thought process that I use when I'm going and mixing one of my tracks. So the first thing that I want to think about is dimensions. Now, what I'm going to be saying, these aren't hard and fast rules. I just like to keep this in mind when I'm working. So we have 3 dimensions when we're mixing in stereo. We have our width, which I'm going to go ahead and actually bring up an imager to show that real quick. Visual. There we go. We have our width, which can be thought about either as left or right or as mid and side. Then we also have depth. Now, depth is a little bit harder to quantify. But we can simulate that using reverb, bringing things closer to the front or the back, which is less in a literal sense, like left and right, and more how we perceive it. So if I were to add more reverb, remove the attack of a sound, and bring it down in volume, I'm going to perceive it as farther back in the mix. And if I leave it as a drier signal and have harder attacks, harder transients, then I'm probably going to perceive that as closer up, more in the front of the mix. And then lastly, I like to think about our frequency distribution. So here I just have an EQ. So these 3 dimensions, if our track were a space, the way I like to think about it is you can't have 2 things in the exact same spot, right? In a room, I can't have a chair in the exact same spot as another chair because the first chair is already there. So I need to keep that in mind and think about where each element fits in. Now, it's important to note that mono only has depth and our frequencies because we don't have any width since it's a mono track. But we're going to ignore that for now. I'm going to get into mono another time. So let's just go through and I can identify where all of these elements sit in terms of these dimensions. That'll maybe help you get a better idea and wrap your head around it. So first up, we're going to start with the kick. Now, as you can see, frequency-wise, the kick is in the low end. It's almost completely mono. So in terms of width, there isn't really much. It just stays right in the center. And then in terms of depth, the signal is pretty dry, so it's up close into the front of the mix. And this clap and this rim I'm going to treat as one thing. In terms of frequency, more up in the mids and the highs. Pretty centered. There's a little bit more stereo width there. And then again, in terms of depth, depth is harder to perceive. It's more in relation to the other elements of the mix. So yes, things can sound far back when they're by themselves, but it's really where it is in relationship to the other elements. Now this kalimba here, it starts out a lot farther back. So you'll notice that it starts out a lot wider because I have it almost entirely the wet signal of the reverb there. I keep a little bit of the dry just so I can have the transient hit, but that's not important. So it starts farther back, and then you'll notice right around here when the reverb turns down, it actually brings itself closer to the front of the mix. And it did get a little bit louder, but you'll notice that the signal level is relatively the same. It's mostly just how we're perceiving it from the reverb. And then it's frequency response. Some of the low mids all the way up to some of the highs as well. And then image-wise, it starts out very wide and then narrows itself more. Although still a little wide. And it's important to note that when I'm saying wide here, I'm talking about the sum and the difference between the left and the right channels. So if something is in mono, that means that the signal coming from the left channel and the signal coming from the right channel are completely together. They're correlated. And if something, as something gets wider, there is less correlation between the channels. So even though it is still centered, it is actually quite wide, or at least in the beginning. It might be a little bit of a foreign concept if you're new to production or to just mixing in general, but it's pretty easy to understand once you get your head around it. There are other great explanations on YouTube with all this stuff. Then we have our hi-hat here, pretty dry in the center, in the high frequencies. These Rhodes are more of a main element. They take up a lot more of the spectrum. So we have the high melody part and then the lower chord part. It kind of stays more around the mids. I guess I was a little wrong. I thought it was more spread out. Then the pad here in the background. And the high mids and is pretty wide. And then lastly the bass, which is completely mono. And in the low end with some stuff up in the highs as well, but it's mostly concentrated in the low and the low mid section. So what was the point of me going through all of that? If you'll notice, with the exception of the kick and the bass, there aren't really elements that serve the same purpose in the same place in the mix. And what I mean by that is we don't have things that are directly on top of each other that we don't want blended. The clap and the rim are in the same place, but we want those to sound like one sound. When I'm listening to this track, I don't want to hear a clap and a rim. I want to hear it as one combined snare clap thingy, whatever you want to call it. So that's why I have those in the same spot. And then the kalimba and the Rhodes are in kind of similar spots. But you'll notice that the kalimba has a lot more up in the high frequencies. And those are accentuated with the EQs, so that way you can pick that out of the mix a little bit better. Hi-hat is way up in the high end, and it's also very sharp, you'll notice. So it's easy to pick out because it's a quick transient hit. So what I'm thinking about when I'm mixing all of this, the first thing that you might notice, especially if you have experience with electronic music, is that the kick and the bass are going to be an issue. They're going to kind of fight for attention in the low end, and that can get a little bit muddy. Now, in the original version, the original project file, where all the stems aren't rendered out, I have a sidechain on the kick and the bass. But in this version, I haven't set that up yet. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick, actually. So the reason I'm sidechaining this is since the kick and the bass are both mono low frequency elements, they take up the same spot in terms of dimensions. So what I'm doing by sidechaining it is ensuring that only one element plays at a time. So the bass is playing the whole time until the kick hits, and then it drops in volume for a second, and then returns. Now everything else is also sidechained, but I'm mostly focused on the issues with the bass because that's really that's really what I'm worried about. So I'm going to go ahead and sidechain everything else as well. To this track. There we go. So hopefully that helps you get a little bit of a better understanding of space in our mix. Next time I'm going to go into some other topics and see if that helps you a little bit more. If you enjoyed this, please subscribe, leave a like, or tell me what was helpful about this, what wasn't helpful, other topics that you want me to talk about, because I'm really just here to help you guys make your music better. And I can't really do that if you don't tell me what is helpful. So thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you next time.